listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
And welcome to this special episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, again brought to you by Real Agriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner, coming to you from our farm here in southern Manitoba. And as we wrap up season 2, we wanted to do a bit of a special discussion episode talking about the topics that we've covered during the Ag Policy Connection podcast this season in 2024. And who better to do that with than the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, Tyler McCann. Tyler, it's great to catch up with you again.
Thank you, Kelvin, for doing this, and thank you for hosting the podcast series. We've been really happy to work with Real Ag on it.
Cool. Likewise, it's been a lot of fun. I know I'm maybe a bit more of a nerd on some of these topics than some people, but yeah, I definitely enjoyed how the conversations came together and discussing these big topics, relevant, timely topics for our Canadian agriculture and farm audience here over the last couple of months. So we touched on definitely some big themes this year, Tyler, in terms of a focus on sustainability and the future of Canadian agriculture as it relates to sustainability. Again, that word is often is a bit of a touch point in terms of defining it, what it looks like, how different people perceive it. We want to talk about some of the big takeaways, of course, in terms of specific topics. We touched on the future of water sustainability policy, politics, land use, trade, ag extension and knowledge transfer, livestock and emissions policy. And finally, our most recent episode featured a panel of farmers talking about how they decide whether to implement sustainable practices on their farm. And of course, for people who haven't listened to each of these episodes, if you hear something come up that's of note in this conversation, I encourage you to go back on realagriculture.com and in any podcast app or on YouTube. You can find all of these episodes and catch up on them. Tyler, what were some of your big takeaways, maybe from a 40,000 foot view, in terms of the conversations that we had on this season?
You know, Kelvin, we first should acknowledge that part of the reason we're able to do this is because of support we get from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Agri-Competitiveness program. And really part of the reasons we get support from that program is to try and help make policy issues more understandable, more relatable, help bring them down to the level that producers understand. I think often we have this idea that policy is something that's made in back rooms or ivory towers, but it really is something that matters to producers from coast to coast, and regardless of what you farm and how you farm it, policy has a pretty big impact. And I think a lot of the messages and I think a lot of the common themes during these episodes really drove home this reality that I think that we sometimes get the policy and the politics confused on things. I think especially around sustainability. You know, the reality is sustainability is complicated, as was said in one of the episodes. There are no silver bullets, but there are a lot of good things that producers could and should be doing anyways. And what we need to do is figure out what are those good things? How do you make the kind of recognize that the good things are going to be different from farm to farm? But what we need is systems in place that help farmers make those good decisions and reward them when they do.
Thanks for the reminder too. It's a good description, Tyler, of what we're trying to accomplish with the Ag Policy Connection is making these topics relevant and helping drive conversation in terms of some of these, like you said, are big problems with no silver bullets, no clear answers. I know Margaret Zafiriou on the land use policy episode referred to how we use land as being a wicked problem. And I know that was a term I'd heard before, so I actually had to Google what a wicked problem is. And that's it's basically a problem where there's too many variables to come up with a clear solution, and the variables are changing and that type of thing. I think it's an economics term, but that describes a lot of these issues. And I think by having conversations about these topics, with people coming from different perspectives, we can hopefully take steps forward and find areas where we agree. And I know that's not always the case, but I think there were maybe one of the surprises from particularly the political panel episode that we had, which featured MPs from the Conservative, Liberal, and NDP parties, basically their leads on the agriculture files, John Barlow, Cody Blois, and Alistair McGregor, we had a challenge actually getting them to disagree. We know, of course, politically there's lots of disagreements, but when it comes to talking about agriculture and sustainability policy, it seemed like they all wanted to agree on government needing to take a carrot approach rather than a stick approach, the importance of productivity, the recognition of agriculture as a solution to climate issues. I know we're only within 2 years of a federal election and nobody wants to say anything negative, but it was actually a bit of a challenge getting them to disagree on the direction that they think policies should take on the environment and agriculture.
And again, it's interesting, Kelvin, because I think one of the things that's frustrated farm groups and those involved in ag policy in Ottawa is the fact that on the carbon tax, there has been bipartisan support for Bill C-282, and you would think that that should be a message, a sign that it's going to be able to sail through and pass Parliament, that it hasn't. Now, clearly a divide in the Liberal caucus on that particular issue. But I think we often think about the Liberal Party, the government, as being focused in urban Canada, not really understanding rural issues. But I really think Cody's a really good example of a Liberal MP that really does get it. The work that he and the Ag Committee do really, I think, does often reflect a consensus, because by and large people do agree, right? Like, this is a complex issue. We need to find solutions that support and encourage farmers. I think that that's inherently hard to disagree with. I do think kind of you take a step down, like go from the 40,000 foot level down to the 10,000 foot level, you might start to see some more differences and you might start to see some disagreement. But, maybe that episode was a bit of a reminder that the conversation at the political level is going to be very different than some of the conversations you had with more of the policy wonks that really do kind of live at the ground level on these issues. I'm not sure how much of that you see in kind of when you're talking to different people on policy issues, but some of us like to live in the detail and the nuance, and not everybody's comfortable in that space.
Yeah, and politicians, unless you really have them in a tough position, often won't get into that level of detail. So that it is understandable, but it's just it was in one of my main observations from that political panel episode, and that still sticks with me today, is that maybe that disconnect isn't necessarily between the parties' views. The differences aren't between the Agriculture Committee members' views, but it's between them and the party brass in terms of the decision makers in some of these caucuses. That disconnect exists between the Cody Bloises in the Liberal Party and the PMO's office, kind of thing. And there is that role that's something that we often talk about in agriculture, is that rural-urban divide, and we, I guess, continue to see that impact agricultural policy and as it's made through the political process in Canada.
Yeah, I think that rural-urban divide has an underappreciated impact. I think some of these things just get taken for granted. But again, go back to land use. I mean, clearly there's a huge difference in the rural-urban divide, and those kind of that urban demand to push urban boundaries out into farmland drives a big source of that conflict. But again, I think that you may see it less with the Conservative MPs, but a rural versus an urban MP, regardless of the party that you're going to come from, is going to have a very different view on the kind of the political or the policy dynamics of any of these issues. But again, it was true in land use. Maybe it was less kind of clear on the episodes, the discussions around like knowledge transfer and extension or methane. But I think that there is still this dynamic that all of those issues, when you're within agriculture, the differences aren't so big. I was struck by the last episode you did with the three different farmer perspectives talking about sustainability. I think going into that, I would have thought those three kind of farm perspectives that you would have had a bit more of a different perspective amongst them. But again, by and large, I think that they agreed on things. And I really do kind of wonder if you could take the politics and you could take the policymakers that aren't that connected to the sector, because that is something that maybe didn't come up in these episodes, but is important. The people in Ottawa doing ag policy are less connected to agriculture than they used to be. But if you could take kind of those people and you could take the politics out of it, I think agriculture could probably get a lot further than it is today, coming up with good policy that would do more to push the sector forward.
Are you saying we have baggage in terms of our background?
I'm saying that I think that we understand the complexities of the system and what it takes to make good outcomes at the end of the day. And you know, I used to think, Kelvin, that agriculture made too much of a big deal about how special it is. But I think what really matters is how different it is. And I think people try and think about what solutions do we have that work somewhere else that we can make work in agriculture. And it just doesn't work that way, right? And you get these kind of dynamics when you hear Nicola and Sean Jakes talking about water issues and those different dynamics across the country, right? I think those are really big differences, and you can't get kind of one water policy across the country. Again, they're talking in that case about you got to look at the watershed issue. So even kind of ignoring provincial boundaries, you know, but the reality is that people that don't get those differences aren't going to appreciate and aren't going to be able to have that meaningful impact the way that maybe some of us with our own baggage, with our own biases might have.
So that ties in with another theme or observation that at least I took away from this season. And that is, Tyler, that a lot of aspects of agriculture, we have this public good, and those of us in farming and in agriculture see the public good, but the public still needs to understand that public good that is being offered. And so, of course, from a political perspective, we see governments tightening purse strings and looking at cuts on the horizon potentially if there's a change in our federal government. And that funding, if it's to be maintained for things like investing in a water strategy or investing in extension services in the future, or if there's going to be ecological goods and services type payments for how land is used, a lot of these things, if there's going to be government money put into these, or voters, Canadians need to understand why government money is being put into it. Otherwise, there's a risk there, and politicians won't see the reasoning for or the justification for putting government money into some of these things. Would you agree with that perspective?
Well, but so I think it's a double-edged sword, right? I think we often like to talk about the public good that farmers bring, that agriculture brings, especially on these kind of landscape issues or water management, biodiversity, carbon sequestration. Agriculture does have, I think, a much greater positive impact than a lot of people make it out to believe. But when government invests money and is delivering that public good outcome, I think that there also needs to be a recognition that government is going to expect returns or delivery on it, you know, some kind of be able to demonstrate that positive outcome at the end of the day. The recent Auditor General's Office report on environmental policy at Ag Canada underscored that the department really doesn't do any I'm going to say any, but effectively doesn't do any monitoring verification of the outcomes of its funding. And so, you know, if we want to get payment from government for these public goods that we provide, I think we need to be prepared that we're going to have to demonstrate outcomes. Conversely, I think that we also need to understand that when it comes to government support for things like knowledge transfer, extension, research, that may mean that government's going to dictate some of the terms of that. And so that is kind of one of those things where at a high level, it's easy to say we all want more government support for EG&S payments. We all want government to invest more in extension services. But all of a sudden, when you get into the details, we may not be happy with government saying, okay, extension officers in southern Saskatchewan, here are the things that we want you to take to talk about. And so trying to find that right balance, trying to kind of figure out how do you build the right systems that recognize the public good, that give government kind of what it needs to kind of demonstrate to those taxpayers that you talked about that it's worth making these investments, but still do it in a way that's kind of open and supportive is that a tough challenge.
Yeah. Along with that, I think we also, in a number of these topics that we covered, we see decision makers are basing their decisions on incentives that are very short-term minded. It's often based on the political cycle or even shorter. And in agriculture, what's good for long-term sustainability in agriculture, it often tends to be longer-term vision, longer-term planning, whether it's saving land for food production instead of turning it into suburban parking lots, or whether it's focusing on trade policies that are good for Canadians as a whole, rather than just a subsector of voters who work in a certain industry type of thing, where we're seeing a trend towards more protectionist trade policies that are short-term, politically voter focused. Is how do we incentivize that longer term perspective that tends to be good for agriculture and the sustainability of agriculture in the long term? That's a question I've been wrestling with as well.
Yeah, so within the constraints of governments that are up for re-election every 4 years, Kelvin, it's pretty hard to figure out how to think longer term than that. That is kind of one of the bugs of the system. I mean, one of the kind of the benefits of it is we get to throw the bums out every 4 years if we don't like the work that they're doing. But again, there's this tension around longer term, and I think it came up on in the episode around extension where this the science is changing, right? I think that we often I think we know kind of the fundamentals of the things that we should be doing to improve soil health or water management or animal health, all of these things over the long term. But the reality is that science changes too. Our understanding of what the impacts are, the kind of the practices that farmers should be implementing evolves over time. I like to think that there's kind of these right enabling conditions, like investing more in R&D, investing more in extension. They're going to be good regardless. But we have to understand that kind of there's a lot of variability and the science is going to change, and things that we think today are good or that are having a really positive impact might evolve over time too. And I think kind of that's the flip side, is how do we kind of build a system so that if things change and all of a sudden we realize that something we've been doing maybe isn't as good as we think it is the system ready for a shock like that? And I'm not sure, Kelvin, kind of your thoughts on this, but I don't get the sense that as a community, agriculture is kind of fully wrapped its head around the fact that, again, the science is evolving, our knowledge is changing on sustainability, and we need to do a better job of accepting that change, that difference over time too.
Yeah, that's a good observation too, and I think, yeah, we do sometimes, we're comfortable with the way we've done things, and we think that this is the best way to do it. And yeah, you're right. I think the innovative farmers and the farmers that ultimately will be sustainable in the long term are continually reviewing practices and policies and wondering whether they're still the best fit for today. But yeah, often, and this is something that we talked about in that farmer panel episode, it comes down ultimately return on investment, ROI, the economics of policy changes and implementing different practices at the farm level is the ultimate driver. But I think we also have seen through some survey work that it's not all about dollars and cents. Sometimes there are other ways of finding value in adopting a different practice or changing maybe a way somebody approaches things. Is that fair as well?
Well, and so I think it's ROI or economics, I think can be a really narrow way to think about it. I often like to talk about it in the context of we need to find things that work for farmers, right? Because it isn't just about financial return. It is about kind of what human resources do you have available to implement these things? What's your knowledge and understanding of them? What capacity do you have? I was talking to somebody last week that was talking about kind of how they're using their yield mapping and their prescription software, but not doing some of the regular soil testing, and kind of they're able to kind of put it all together and make it all work in ways that maybe not everybody would want to do that, and dig into kind of how do you fit the different tools together. And so I think it is clearly about ROI, but it's not just about ROI. It has to be about how do you make it fit and work. And again, I think that's something that governments don't do a good job of. And I think we heard about, for example, on the methane one, right? It's kind of what you need is a whole bucket of different things that you can use to support the sector as it goes down this road. And again, I don't think that we always do well with kind of a complicated government. I think it's got some issues trying to deliver complicated programming or approaches. But I think equally, I think that there is this sense that, one, that things are good today, but also I think farmers often prefer a silver bullet, or we look for the easy solution too. So how do you kind of create the right space for that? And it's not always evident.
So Tyler, I kind of dabble in the policy world, hosting this podcast and talking about it on talking about different ag policies on Friday Issues panel on Real Ag Radio and that type of thing. But you work in this all the time. How do you one of the things I've struggled with on this season is like you said, I would like straightforward answers on some of these policies, and maybe silver bullet is maybe too strong a word, but it'd be nice if there was a clear direction on where government should go in terms of balancing the interests of society, and that includes agriculture and food production, farming as well. How do you how do you find that challenge of all these wicked problems, again, to use that term? There's you can have paralysis by analysis on a lot of these things, and it's sometimes tough to figure out what direction to take, whether we're talking about land use policy or water strategies and treating water as I think everybody can agree we should treat water as a strategic asset, but what does that actually look like, and how do you prioritize how water gets used, and what aspects get measured, and what gets prioritized in terms of different uses and that type of thing? How do you, as somebody who works in the policy world all the time, deal with that issue of not often having easy, clear direction to take?
Well, so I think we've tried to focus on this point recently. Often there is no right answer, right? What there is a series of different answers, different options with different trade-offs. And one of the episodes touched on this point, where we need to do a better job of understanding what the different trade-offs are with these different approaches to sustainability and different efforts. And I do really personally believe, and I think it's embodied in the work that we try and do at CAPI, is we need a better understanding of what those different options are, what are the pros and cons, and we need a context where we can talk about them and we can debate them, and we can understand that actually we do need to kind of roll up our sleeves and get a little bit dirty. And I think farmers understand what it's like to get dirty when they're working. I think the policymakers need to get dirty too, and they need to be able to stand up and say, hey, look, this is different. There are different options. There are different pros and cons. We've weighed them. We've debated them, and this is the decision that we've made, and these are the actions that we're going to take. The problem is, Kelvin, I think we've got ourselves into this trap today that we do think that kind of these open-ended consultations or kind of ongoing dialogue is the solution. And that's not at all what I think what we need. I think what we need is action, but we need to be able to have a real serious, honest, open discussion about it, put our pros and cons on the table, put the details on the table, make a decision and move on and act on it. And that's, I think we've got this, we've too easily fall into analysis paralysis. But that's not to say that we don't need more open, honest, kind of thorough debate and dialogue on these issues. And we need people to put some big ideas on the table too sometimes to open that up.
Yeah, you need visionaries, you need leaders, you need people selling ideas, and often that is how that movement happens. One point you made there, Tyler, in terms of needing the data and understanding, and I think this is a big part of what CAPI does too, in terms of the research to support policies or to support decisions around policies. That was a common theme as well, I'd say, in terms of these different topics that we covered over the last couple of weeks. In general, we need better data. We need better research to inform decisions, whether we're talking about livestock emissions. Well, that was one point that was made where, sure, with the last decade or two, there's been this mainstream push to say eat less beef kind of thing, without understanding all the trade-offs there in terms of impact on the environment, the loss of carbon sequestration on grasslands and that type of thing. So it just seems like in general, if there is a place that government should invest or prioritize, it is often on the data and research side of things, where there's a public good. And I think in some cases industry also benefits from that. But we having better understanding and monitoring, surveillance data, trade would be another example where I think there's a lot of pressure on this front as well, in terms of having metrics and agreed on definitions of things for tracking different aspects. And I think that would be good for Canadian agriculture in that sense as well.
Yeah, but Kelvin, I think we often can use data as a crutch and say that we need better data. When data doesn't tell you what to do, right? Data will tell you how things are, but data won't tell you data will tell you what the soil organic carbon content of your soil is. Data will not tell you whether or not that's good or that's bad soil organic carbon content. Data will not tell you whether or not you as a farmers should get a carbon credit for that level of soil organic carbon that's in your soil. And so I think that we get really caught up on data. It is clearly a big piece of the puzzle. Again, on the trade front, having that standardized data around the world is essential to creating a level playing field and ensuring that we're not going to get stuck with burdensome regulations. But again, we talk about science-based decision making, and I think again that really dumbs down often what needs to be science-based but risk-based, right? We need to understand what are the consequences of it all, and we need to kind of be able to put that all together in a meaningful way. And again, that's not always easy, and data is really only part of it. And on the research side more broadly, we do have a lot of research. And we've got great universities across the country with great academics in them doing all sorts of research. We then need to be able to take that and translate that into something that's easily and understood by people that are trying to make policy decisions. And we miss that. I think if you look at what happens in the United States with land grant universities, with extension experts that are there, these aren't just extension experts that are helping people make cropping decisions. They've got extension economists that are out trying to help people relate kind of what's going on and help explain what the different options are from a policy environment. We really don't have that here in this country, and it's a shame, because there is a need to better kind of create a community of people that can take the research, can take the data, and then translate that into, again, some of those options and help understand the trade-offs that are involved.
So you're saying we have too many silos in Canada, or is that yes, we have too many silos. That's absolutely a part of it. I do think that there's a bit of an issue with academia that it's a bit too disconnected from what's going on, kind of especially in the policy world that I work in every day. But I think we have a hard time translating kind of what happens in academia, the work that happens in academia, or the work that happens on farm, into what does it mean for the policy world. And again, we have a lot of economists. We don't have enough political scientists that talk about agriculture and agriculture issues, and we don't have enough people that are involved in kind of that ag community. I often get a bit jealous in Ottawa, where if you look at the people that spent their careers working on foreign affairs or trade or defense issues, they tend to stay as a bit of a club of people. The Canadian Global Affairs Institute that we've worked with from time to time keeps them together. And these are people that are really engaged in what role does Canada play in? And we tend not to have that on ag issues. And the federal government in particular, and I think a lot of provinces as well, have kind of done away with the idea of an ag subject matter expert. And it's unfortunate, because I think we need, and it's not just silos, but it's, policy making and how government works is different. And I think we need more people that get it and think about it and think about, okay, so it's one thing to say we want farmers to have more buffer strips, or we want farmers to be more responsible with pesticide use, or we need, we're concerned to go back to land use in Alberta. We're concerned about renewable energy, being put on farms in Alberta. But there's like a ton of different ways that you can deal with any of those issues. And governments have a variety of different tools. And it's one thing to say, we want carrots, not sticks. But how do you actually think through what those carrots are that you're going to want to use and put them into practice is something that's a bit of I don't think that gets enough attention in the sector. Is one of the reasons our vast geography and regionality of Canadian agriculture, Tyler, behind that? We have so many different, I know some people have pushed the idea that we actually have like 3 or 4 different countries within Canadian agriculture, the way that some of that is policy driven, some is physical geography driven, some is maybe cultural differences, even in terms of some of these issues.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, Kelvin. Like, I don't think it's I don't think it's any one of those things. I think it's all of those things together. But I think it's about an issue of how do we actually really figure out how to address those, right? We are regionally very different, culturally very different, but I like our country being together, so there's really no way to avoid that. And then so it's a matter of kind of how do you put those systems together. And we didn't necessarily get into it in this episode, the first season. You got into this with some of them, but understanding what level of government should do what is, I think, an underappreciated, under-discussed issue in agriculture today. I think really, if you wanted to get better outcomes, we would have far more active provincial departments of agriculture and far less active federal departments of agriculture. I think it's a bit of the federal government seems to have more money kind of floating around these days, and so they're spending more and they're pushing into areas of action that they probably shouldn't be if we wanted to get better outcomes. But again, that's something that I don't know how many people across the country would want to get into talking about, is ag extension something the federal government should be doing or the provincial government should be doing? Because there are really big differences depending on which level of government does it and what role they're playing on it. I think we have a tendency to want the federal government to do it all, but I don't think that that's the best outcome at the end of the day.
Yeah, and you could compare it to the healthcare system in terms of the federal transfer to the provinces for delivery, and I'm not sure that model we would say is really thriving or a success story either. But I can see the reasons for it, and this is a timely discussion. Of course, this week as we're recording this, ministers from across the country are headed to Whitehorse for the annual FPT meeting, and one of the big discussions there is always how much are each level of government going to pony up for business risk management programs and other types of ag programming.
But I mean, you must notice this, Kelvin, if you think about the conversations that you have on the radio show, the interviews that you do, the people you talk to across the country, right? I think that there's a bit of a desire to talk about, again, practices or kind of these big picture issues. But I don't think, unfortunately, we talk enough about kind of the mechanics of who does what or the reasons why we're doing things or the approaches that are there. Again, we're probably a lot in the nuance and maybe not necessarily kind of big sound bites coming out of these episodes, but do you think that we have enough of that kind of nuanced, thoughtful discussion, or is that something we need to find ways to do more of?
Well, you're asking me personally. I would say we need more of that, and that's one of the reasons why we're actually doing this podcast. I'd say too, is so that we can have some of these discussions about some of the nuance. But yeah, in general, I'm not sure that there are many places left. Some of that conversation I think happens on social media, and of course it's always been in coffee shops too. But I don't know. I think in terms of vision and big ideas, CAPI is, I think, fostering a lot of that, Tyler. But I'm not sure. And of course, in some of the farm groups, these discussions are taking place as well. Once a year around the FPT meeting, there's some of this. But in general, and it's something that I know in agriculture we often bemoan. Like you said, we think our sector is special and that it deserves attention, that more attention than what it gets from policymakers. But yeah, this is another one of these issues where I'm not sure there's a silver bullet or an easy solution.
Well, you talked about kind of big ideas. I'm maybe becoming more skeptical about the need for big ideas or big bold vision.
I thought you were a big ideas guy.
I do like my big ideas. Again, I think we need to spend 2% of farm cash receipts on R&D. That's the big idea that I'm pushing now. I actually think it's just ideas, right? So I'll go back to, I think that the federal government should not be involved in extension. I think that should be provincial governments that's there. I'm not sure that should count as a big idea, but I think that if you could get that kind of agreement around how that would work together, I think that the system would work a lot better. And I think that federal government could maybe focus on some of the things that it's not focusing on today. Instead, I think that what we need is ideas, and then I think what we need is action. And I worry that we get so caught up in, hey, we need big ideas, or we need big bold visions, or we need kind of all of these things, that we lose track of actually what we need to do is to get things happening. And we maybe didn't get into it as much, but on things like, again, that last farmer episode that we talked about, there are some big differences on it. The federal government is committed $750 million, $750 million on-farm adoption, and I'm not sure that that's the right job of the federal government to be spending that money. That traditionally the provinces have been doing it, and again, I think that there's a temptation to say, okay, we need federal government to pay more. I just don't think that that's there. But we get caught up in, we've got a sustainable ag strategy coming eventually, maybe. A lot of ideas about, we need to spend a lot of money to support it, and maybe it's less about kind of billion-dollar commitments and more about what are kind of the smaller things that we can do that'll have an impact, and how do we get the provinces more involved? How do we get municipal governments more involved? How do we get the private sector more involved? Because the private sector has got a big role to play, and on all of these sustainability issues, I mean, they're often not at the table as much as they should be.
Yeah. Finally, then, Tyler, I think a lot of these conversations are quite timely right now, too. And I think there is actually maybe some more, now that I think about it, some more discussion happening about big picture. Why are we doing things this way? What should it look like in the future? And a lot of that, I think, is being driven by the potential of a change in federal government here and the pressures that there are fiscally for government spending. Is it fair to say that some of these big conversations are happening, and what do you see as the next steps? I'm not going to, we're not going to guarantee that we're going to have a conservative government in a year and a half time, but it sure looks that way in the polls, and I think there's a lot of people preparing for that change. In terms of policy changes, is this the time to do a big revamp and maybe not a revolution, but a big change in terms of shaking up how agriculture policy is shaped and what it looks like in Canada?
I think the short answer is yes, right? So we're on version 5 of the Ag Policy Framework, and really, with the exception of this most recent one where the federal government came to the table with a little bit more money, the only changes that we've really seen are scaling back and reductions in spending. I think that you do need to go back and look at kind of that base framework for how we spend and who does what. But I think that discussion with Cody and John and Alistair should have shed some light around kind of what the change is happening. And again, I think we all would have benefited with a bit more of a clearer kind of distinction around kind of where each party stands on the issue and what positions they're going to take into the next government. But I think that there was one of the common themes through all of the episodes was, again, I think sustainability can be a really good thing for farmers. It can be a way to boost productivity. It can be a way to boost profitability. There is a potential to increase returns through more sustainable practices. So we don't want that to go away. And, I think that there's kind of a political kind of desire. Some of the rhetoric that Poilievre uses is around axe the tax. But axe the tax isn't a very sophisticated approach to sustainability policy. And so I think that there's still some room to go to say, okay, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Clearly, we need to make changes. $750 million for on-farm practice adoption may not last under a conservative government that's trying to figure out how do we save some money. But what do we do instead? And how do we make sure that there's still meaningful investment at the end of the day? How do we, and again, not just public investment, and we often think about this in the public policy context, but we heard over and over again, the private sector's driving this. The private sector's got Scope 3 reporting. The private sector's got its commitments that it needs to live up to too. So how do we create that space where the public and private sector can still do meaningful things on sustainability under a government that's going to be less concerned about sustainability than our current one is?
Yeah. Well, lots of room for future conversations about this, Tyler. I think we've maybe solved all the problems that we can today. So, and I know you have a busy schedule today too. So thank you for taking the time to do this wrap up, kind of a recap and a rehash of some of the things that we learned on this season of the Ag Policy Connection. Thanks again to CAPI for partnering with us at Real Agriculture on this podcast series again.
Yeah, and thank you, Kelvin. Thank you for hosting it. Thank you to Ag Canada for supporting it. And hopefully we'll see everybody soon for season 3.
That would be great. Thank you, everybody. And again, if you haven't listened to the entire season, or if you want to go back and listen again, all the episodes are at realagriculture.com and in your podcast feed under Real Agriculture in any podcast app, or on YouTube. You can find us as well. Just search on Google, might be the easiest way to get there. Thanks again to CAPI for partnering with Real Agriculture. And that's it for season 2 of the Ag Policy Connection. Thank you all for joining us. And until next time, take care.